4 minutes. Just 4 minutes. What would you think if I told you that the distance between the life you are living right now and the life you have wanted for as long as you can remember is not measured in years, or in money, or in luck, or in how hard you are willing to work, but in 4 minutes of a particular kind of attention that almost no one alive has ever been taught how to give? You don't need to meditate for an hour a day to close that distance. You don't need to paper your walls with affirmations, or wake at 5 in the morning, or repeat a phrase into a mirror until the words stop meaning anything, or spend another year of your one life waiting for a sign from the universe that was never going to come. The only thing required is that you close your eyes and do one particular thing, one act that is already encoded in you, already available, already sitting in the deepest architecture of your mind, where it has been since the day you were born, waiting for someone to tell you it was there. What I am about to share with you is not positive thinking, nor is it a fairy tale or a trick of the mind. It is a clinical technique found by a man who nearly lost his sanity discovering it, tested on his own psyche for 6 years before he ever offered it to a patient, and recorded in a red leather book that the world was not permitted to read for almost a century. His name was Carl Jung. He said it took him 45 more years to distill what happened to him in those 6 years into something usable, and it has quietly rewritten more human lives than any self-help book ever printed, including, if you stay with me, yours. In the winter of 1913, Carl Jung was 38 years old and, by every external measure, finished. He had been Freud's chosen successor, the crown prince of the entire psychoanalytic movement, Freud's own words for him. And then he had broken with Freud, publicly and irreparably, and the world he had built around himself came apart in a matter of months. Within the year he had walked away from the university and from the presidency of the movement he was supposed to inherit. He stopped publishing. He sat in his study in Kusnacht and found that he could not think. What happened next, Jung would spend the rest of his life trying to describe. Things began to arrive. He heard them first, then saw them. Images rose in him that he could not account for and could not stop. He wrote later, in exactly these words, that he decided he was menaced by a psychosis. At one point, a voice in a dream told him that if he could not understand what he had been shown, he must shoot himself. There was a loaded revolver in his night table drawer. He wrote that he became frightened. Then he did something no psychiatrist in Europe would have advised, and that most would have called suicide. Instead of resisting, he let himself go down. Dropping through a floor is how he described it. Night after night, he lowered his own consciousness deliberately into the material that was trying to surface. Not to analyze it, not to interpret it, but to meet it. To let the images come, and to stay with them, and to speak to them as though they were real. This went on for 6 years. All of it went on paper. First into a set of small black notebooks, then, slowly, in an enormous folio bound in red leather, in medieval script, with his own hand-painted illuminations, a book he never published, that his family kept locked away, and that the public was not allowed to see until 2009, 96 years after he started it. Its title was Liber Novus, the New Book. The world calls it the Red Book. Inside it, he was not recording fantasies. He was running an experiment. Because here is what Jung discovered down there, and it is the thing that everything else in this video rests on. The images did not behave like imagination. More like encounters. They argued with him. They told him things he did not know. One of them, a figure he called Philemon, an old man with the horns of a bull and the wings of a kingfisher, walked with him in his garden and taught him something Jung said he could not have arrived at alone. Philemon told him he was wrong to treat thoughts as though he generated them, that thoughts were more like animals in a forest, or people in a room, or birds in the air. If you should see people in a room, you would not think that you had made those people. Jung wrote that it was Philemon who taught him psychic objectivity, the reality of the psyche. The recognition that the inner world is not a private theater you are staging. It is a place, and it is real, and what happens in it happens. When he came back up, when the flood receded and he could work again, he did not treat those 6 years as an illness he had survived. Those 6 years became a discovery he had to systematize. Everything Jung produced for the next 40 years, every book, every concept the world now knows him for, came out of that descent. He said so himself. Plainly, it took him virtually 45 years to distill, within the vessel of his scientific work, the things he had experienced and written down at that time. And the single most practical thing he brought back, a technique he first described in 1916, did not publicly name until a lecture in London 2 decades later, and then used with patience until the end of his life. He called active imagination. That is what you came here for. You just didn't know its name. Active imagination is not visualization. It is not daydreaming, and it is not affirmation, and it is emphatically not pretending. It is the deliberate, controlled entry into a state where the image you hold is granted the same status as the room you are sitting in, and where the feeling that image produces in your body is treated not as a symptom of the image, but as the point of it. Jung's own account of what it did for him is 1 sentence long, and it is worth hearing exactly as he wrote it. To the extent that I managed to translate the emotions into images, that is to say, to find the images which were concealed in the emotions, I was inwardly calmed and reassured. Read that again and notice the direction of travel. He did not think his way to a feeling, finding the image already hiding inside the feeling and then inhabiting it. That is what changed the feeling. That is the whole mechanism. That is the 4 minutes. In about 90 seconds, before I explain a single thing about how or why it works, I am going to give you a compressed version of it that you can do in this chair, right now, while the video keeps playing. Do this with me. Not later. Now. You don't have to close your eyes if you're somewhere you can't. Soften them instead. Let them go slightly out of focus on whatever is in front of you. Take 1 breath in through your nose and let it out through your mouth, longer on the way out than on the way in. Now bring to mind the one thing you want most, not the list. The one. Don't picture it. Don't try to see it clearly. Clarity is not what we're after, and it never was. Instead, ask yourself 1 question, and let your body answer it before your mind can. If this were already done, if it had been settled an hour ago, and I already knew, what would be different in me right now? Wait for it. Something will shift. It's small. Most people miss it because they're expecting a vision, and what arrives is a temperature change. Maybe your shoulders drop half an inch. Maybe your jaw releases, and you didn't know it was held. Maybe there's a warmth that moves through your chest, or your breathing goes deeper without you instructing it to, or something behind your eyes stops bracing. There, whatever moved in your body, however faint, however brief, that is the thing, not the picture, not the words. The physical, involuntary, unmistakable shift that happened in you the moment your nervous system entertained the possibility that it was already done, already settled, already behind you. Nothing about that was decided. You could not have performed it if you tried. It happened because some part of you took the premise seriously for a second and a half. That was active imagination. Badly done, and for 11 seconds, and without any of the structure that makes it work. But you did it, and something in you responded. Now imagine what 4 deliberate minutes of it does. Everything that follows in this video is about making that shift deeper, making it last, and this is the part almost nobody gets right, not destroying it in the 18 hours afterward. If something in that last minute moved in you, if your body answered a question your mind couldn't, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe to Carl Jung Philosophy and turn the notifications on, because what comes next is material Jung spent the rest of his life organizing, and you will not find it assembled like this anywhere else. And stay with me all the way to the end. Not because I'm asking you to, because the 5 elements of this practice are useless in isolation, and the ones almost everyone skips, the 4th and the 5th, are the 2 that decide whether any of this works at all. Most people who fail at this do not fail during the 4 minutes. They fail in the 20 minutes after. We'll get there. Now I want to tell you why the thing you want has not arrived, and I want to be precise about it, because the honest answer is not the one you have been given. It is not that you didn't want it enough, nor is it that you were born without luck, or into the wrong family, or in the wrong decade. It is not that you failed to work hard enough. Most people reading their own life story get this backwards and assume the effort was insufficient when the effort was the only thing that was ever abundant. Underneath all of that sits something else. You have been trying to change your life from a state that requires your life to stay as it is. Read that slowly, because everything else is a restatement of it. You have been reaching for the thing from the posture of someone who does not have it, and the posture is the message. That reaching is the not having, expressed in the only language your deeper mind reads. Jung's entire clinical position was that the psyche is not a passive recorder of what happens to you. He argued, against the whole intellectual current of his century, that the psyche is real, that it is a fact, that an image held with feeling is not a shadow cast by the world. It is a thing with weight of its own, and the deepest layers of a person do not distinguish between what happened and what was fully lived inwardly. In 1916, in the middle of his own collapse, he wrote a line in a letter to a woman he was treating. Everyone quotes it now. Almost nobody knows the condition he wrote it in, barely holding together, to someone else barely holding together, which is the only condition under which anyone has ever meant it. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. Almost nobody hears what that line costs. Because if it is true, if the inner state is the causal layer and not the reporting layer, then every hour you spent adjusting the outside while the inside stayed identical was an hour spent rearranging furniture in a house you were not living in. Let me give this to you 9 different ways, because it is the only idea in this video, and one of these 9 will be the one that gets through. 1. You are standing in a workshop that has every material required to make the thing you want. The metal is there. The mold is there. The instructions are on the wall. And the furnace has never once been lit. You have spent years acquiring more metal. 2. You are holding a seed in your closed hand and asking why there is no tree. And you are not being lazy. You are gripping that seed with everything you have, checking it hourly, terrified of dropping it. It cannot grow in your hand. It was never going to. It needs to be somewhere dark, somewhere you cannot see it, somewhere you are not watching. 3. In old photography, there was a stage called the latent image. You exposed the plate, and the picture was already on it, completely, in full detail, and completely invisible. Nothing you could do by staring would reveal it. It needed one chemical bath, for one exact duration, and then it appeared all at once as though it had arrived from nowhere. It had not arrived from anywhere. It had been there the whole time, waiting for the right medium. Your desire is a latent image. You are trying to see it by staring harder. 4. Strike a tuning fork in a room full of instruments, and only the strings tuned to that note will answer. Not the loudest string, not the newest, the matching one. The world is not deaf to what you want. It is mechanically only able to answer what you are sounding. 5. A river does not choose its path. It follows the channel that previous water carved, and every year the channel deepens, and the deeper it gets, the less possible it becomes for the water to go anywhere else. Your inner state has been carving that channel your entire adult life. You have not been failing to redirect the river. You have been trying to redirect it without ever touching the bed. 6. Imagine building a house and walking out to the street every 20 minutes to check whether it is finished yet. Each trip out is a trip away from the work. This is what wanting does. Wanting is the trip to the street. It feels like devotion, and it functions like abandonment. 7. The world is a mirror, and a mirror is not a servant. It will not show you what you request. It has no capacity to. It reflects, with perfect and indifferent accuracy, the thing standing in front of it. And you have been standing in front of it, year after year, in the exact posture of a person who does not have what they are asking for, and then reading the reflection as a verdict on your worth. 8. The lock has been in front of you the whole time, and you have been trying to force it. The key is in your own pocket. Not metaphorically. Jung's point was more literal than that. The capacity to enter the state that produces the change is native equipment, standard issue. You were born with it, and you used it constantly as a child, and somewhere around the age of 11, you were taught to be embarrassed by it. 9. And there is the door. That one. The one I put in front of you in the first 30 seconds of this video. You are still standing there. And you have spent a decade knocking and calling out and checking whether anyone is coming. And the door was never locked, and it does not open outward, and it has no handle on this side. It opens when the person standing at it stops being a person who is waiting. And now I want you to hear the one word this entire practice turns on, because you will use it every day for the rest of your life, and almost nobody has ever pointed at it. One word: already. Not will be, not is coming, not one day, not soon, not when the timing is right. Every one of those puts the thing at a distance from you and then asks you to feel good about the distance. Already. Your body already knows how to produce the state you want. You have already felt it, more than once, about something else. The capacity is already installed, already tested, already sitting in you, unused. What you are asking for has already been received by people no more deserving and considerably less prepared than you are. And the shift you are chasing has already happened in you 100 times by accident, for 11 seconds at a stretch, and you have never once been taught to notice it, or hold it, or do it on purpose. That is the whole distance, not years, not luck. The difference between I want this and this is already handled, held for 4 minutes, on purpose, by you. Now, everything above this line is diagnosis, and diagnosis without a procedure is only a more sophisticated way to feel bad. So here is the procedure. 5 elements. All 5 delivered in this video, in order, with nothing held back and nothing saved for a part 2. 4 of them take place inside the 4 minutes. The 5th takes place in the rest of your life, and it is the one that determines whether the other 4 amount to anything at all. Element 1. The retreat. Where and how you enter, and why the state matters more than the location. 2. The question. A single sentence you ask, which is not an affirmation, and which is the hinge the entire practice turns on. 3. The inhabitation. How to be inside the scene instead of watching it, and the difference between the two that decides everything. 4. The seal. What you do with it afterward. This is the element nobody teaches, and it is the reason most people's practice leaks away by Thursday. 5. The return. Carrying the state back into an ordinary Tuesday without your own life dismantling it by 10 in the morning. 4 minutes. 5 elements. Let's begin. The first element is retreat, and I want to strip something away before I build anything. You do not need a special room. No candles, no incense, no cushion that costs 60 pounds, or a corner of your home consecrated to this. Every one of those things is a way of making the practice feel significant, and significance is not what makes it work. In fact, the more ceremony you build around it, the more you are quietly telling yourself that this is a rare and difficult thing that requires ideal conditions. Neither is true. Jung built himself a stone tower at Bollingen on the upper lake at Zurich and worked on it for over 30 years. No electricity, no running water for most of its life. He cut and set some of the stone himself, and he wrote that there he was, in the midst of his true life, most deeply himself. And he did not need the tower to do the work. The tower was where he went to live, the way the work had already taught him to live. The technique itself he ran in consulting rooms, in his study, on trains. The place is permission, not mechanism. Yours can be a bedroom with the door shut, a parked car outside your own house, with the engine off, a bathroom at 11 at night, a bench with a coat pulled up. What matters is not the room. What matters is that for 4 minutes, nothing is allowed to reach you. That means the phone is not face down. It is in another room, or it is off. Face down is not off. Face down is a phone you are still partly listening for, and a part of your attention stays posted at the door like a servant waiting for a knock. 4 minutes of undivided is worth more than 40 of divided, and this is not a motivational statement. It is a statement about what the deeper mind will and will not open for. It will not open while any part of you is on call. Now, the state. Sit however you can sit without effort. Upright is better than slumped, but not rigid. You are not performing discipline for anyone. Let your hands rest wherever they fall. Let your jaw come unhooked. Most people carry their entire week in the jaw and the space between the eyebrows and have not noticed in years. Close your eyes and then breathe in a pattern. Normal in, long out. Longer on the exhale than the inhale. Every time. You don't need to count. Your body knows how to do this and has been waiting to be allowed to. Do this for perhaps 40 seconds and watch for the moment when something in your chest lets go, because there is one, and it is unmistakable when you stop trying to force it. What you are reaching for is a threshold, and it has a name in the literature. It is the border zone between waking and sleep, the state you pass through every single night on your way down, and every morning on your way up, and normally cross so fast you have no memory of it. In that zone, one thing happens. The part of you that argues gets quiet. Not gone, quiet. Your internal auditor, the one that hears "I am at ease about money" and answers with the current balance, loses its grip in that state. Not because you defeated it, because it, like the rest of you, is on its way to sleep. There is your doorway, not a mood. A measurable, repeatable, physiological doorway that you cross twice a day already, and that this practice asks you to stop at instead of falling through. So, 40 seconds of long exhales, a soft jaw, a body that has stopped bracing, and none of that is preparation for the practice. It is a quarter of the practice. Now the second element, and this is the hinge. Everything before this was approach. Everything after this is consequence. The practice turns here, on a single sentence, and I want you to notice immediately what kind of sentence it is. It is not an affirmation. You are not going to tell yourself anything. You are not going to declare that you are wealthy, or loved, or well, or repeat a statement your body will quietly file under things we are saying now. Affirmation fails for a reason that is almost insultingly simple. A declaration invites contradiction. Say I am wealthy inside a mind that has seen your bank balance, and you have not planted anything. You have started an argument, and you will lose it, because the other side has evidence. So you do not declare, you ask. Here is the sentence. Take it word for word. If this were already done, if it had already happened, and I already knew, what would I feel right now? Then you stop talking, and you wait. Notice what that question does that a declaration cannot. It does not assert anything the mind can dispute. It is conditional. It is hypothetical. It slips past the auditor entirely, because the auditor has no objection to a question. There is nothing in it to contradict. And in the 4 or 5 seconds after you ask it, while the conscious mind is still holding the door politely open, something else answers. Your body answers. And it has never once in your life been able to lie about this. This is the exact move Jung described in that sentence I read you earlier, finding the image concealed inside the emotion. Except we are running it in the other direction, on purpose. He went from feeling to image. You are going to go from a supposed image to feeling, and then live in the feeling, because the feeling is the operative layer and always was. Now, what comes back will be small, and I need to prepare you for that, because the size of it is where almost everyone quits. You are not going to see a film. There will not be a vision. There will not be light behind your eyelids, or a voice, or a certainty descending on you like weather. If you are waiting for a cinematic experience, You will sit there for 4 minutes, get nothing, decide you are one of the people this doesn't work for, and never do it again. What actually arrives is physical, quiet, and easy to miss. A loosening at the back of the neck, a warmth spreading across the chest, the involuntary long exhale, the one you didn't ask for and didn't perform, that arrives without you. Sometimes a smile you did not decide to make, arriving on your face 2 seconds before you notice it. Sometimes the throat going thick, because underneath a want that old there is usually grief. That is the answer. That faint, physical, unglamorous shift is the entire prize. And here is why it is enough. It is involuntary. You cannot perform a real drop in shoulder tension. The nervous system does not respond to instruction that way. So when it happens, you have proof you can feel, that something below the level of your arguing mind briefly accepted a premise it had refused for years. There is the crack. 4 minutes a day is how you widen it. Nothing new is being built in there. You are returning to something already built. Your body already knows this state. It has been in it before, on some ordinary afternoon, when a thing you had been dreading turned out to be already resolved, and you felt the whole weight come off you in a single second. Nothing was different about the world in that second, only what you knew about it. From tonight, you produce it on purpose, every day, for 4 minutes. Ask the question about the specific thing. Be concrete about the thing and vague about the mechanism. This matters enormously, and I'll come back to it. If it is money, if the pressure were already gone. Not if I had 400,000 pounds. The number is not what your body responds to. The absence of the tightness is. If it is love, if I were already known by someone, and it were already settled, and I were already not looking anymore. Not a face, not a name, the end of the search. If it is health, if the fear about my body were already behind me, not a scan result. The morning after. Notice that all three are the same sentence. Something you have carried is already put down. Something you have watched for is already arrived. Something you have braced against is already over. You are never asking for the thing. You are asking your body what it is like on the far side of already having it. Always the state, never the mechanism. Ask, wait, let the body answer. So much for element 2. Now, do you want to know where almost everyone loses this? Because you now have half of it. You have the entrance, and you have the hinge. And if you did nothing else with this video, you would already have more of the actual Jungian method than 90% of the people who quote him online. And half of it will do nothing for you, not less, nothing. What comes next is the part that is almost never taught, because it is the unglamorous part. It doesn't photograph well, there's no moment in it, and it asks something of you that most people are not willing to give. It is also, by an enormous margin, the part that separates the people this works for from the people it doesn't. So stay with me, because the next 20 minutes contain the 3 elements that do the actual work. The one mistake that quietly destroys everything you've built in the 4 minutes, and the reason your practice will feel powerful on Monday and dead by Thursday if nobody warns you. Someone encountering this material for the first time will almost always do the same thing with it. They will try to make it harder. Within a day of learning it, the questions start arriving. What time of day is optimal? Does it have to be 4 minutes, or is 5 better? Is there a breathing count? Does it work if I've been drinking? Should I do it facing a particular direction, or write it down first, or say it aloud, or is silent better? Is there an order for the 3 archetypes? Should I do all of them, or pick one? And I understand every one of those questions because I recognize what is underneath them. It is not curiosity. It is control. Every one of those questions is the same question wearing a different coat. Tell me the exact conditions so that I can guarantee the outcome. And the desire to guarantee the outcome is the precise state this practice exists to dissolve. You cannot use a technique for releasing your grip as a new and more sophisticated way to grip. So let me take the pressure off you completely. You do not need to do this perfectly. There is no need to do it at the same time every day. 4 minutes is a guideline, not a threshold. 3 is fine. 6 is fine. Your mind will wander, and that is not failure. That is what minds do, and the return from the wander is itself the repetition that builds the thing. If you fall asleep during it, you have not failed. You have arrived at the doorway and gone through, which is the least harmful mistake available to you. No version of this is bad enough to stop it working. The only failure available to you is not doing it. But there is one error that genuinely does undo it, and it is not on anybody's list. You cannot dictate the mechanism. Here is what that means in practice. You want the money, and while you are in the state, you find yourself specifying that it comes through the promotion. You want the relationship, and you find yourself putting a particular person's face in the scene. You want the health, and you are inwardly negotiating which treatment, which doctor, which month. Every one of those is the same move. You have taken a state and converted it back into a plan. A plan is a demand with a deadline attached, and a demand is made from the precise posture of not having that you sat down to leave. Jung was insistent on this in his clinical work, and it is one of the most misunderstood parts of him. He held that the unconscious is not a vending machine you operate. It is an other, something with its own intelligence, its own timing, and its own opinion about your life, frequently a better informed one than yours. His entire concept of individuation rests on it. The process is not you imposing a design on the psyche. It is a negotiation, and you are not the senior party. So your job is the state. The what, the how, is not your department. It never was, and every minute you spend adjudicating it is a minute spent back in the posture you came here to leave. This is not passivity. I want to be very clear about that, because this is where this material gets misread into something lazy and dangerous. You will still act, you will still apply, ask, train, save, show up, do the difficult thing on the difficult day. Nothing here replaces any of that. But there is an enormous difference between action taken from lack and action taken from completion, and everyone on the receiving end of it can feel which one they are dealing with, even when they could not tell you how. Action from lack has a smell. It is the email that tries slightly too hard. It is the ask with an apology folded into it. It is the interview where you are auditioning instead of assessing. It is the second message sent 9 hours after the first. Action from completion does not perform. It does not chase, and it does not oversell, and it is not injured by a no. Same actions. Entirely different state underneath. And the state is what people are responding to. It always has been. Something most channels in this space will never say to you, and I would sooner you heard it from me than found it out later and feel misled. Jung did not design this for getting things. That is the truth. He developed active imagination as a way of coming into relationship with the parts of a person that the person has disowned. The shadow, the material that will run your life from underneath if you never turn and look at it. He thought it was demanding work. He warned that for certain people, at certain moments, it could be genuinely destabilizing, and he did not hand it out casually. The 4-minute practice in this video is built on his mechanism. It is not built on his intention. I'm telling you that for 2 reasons. One is that you deserve to know which parts of what you're hearing are Jung and which parts are the use we are putting him to. Almost nobody in this corner of the internet will draw that line for you, and the ones who don't draw it are usually the ones inventing quotations. My second reason is more practical, because when you sit down and ask that question tonight, something other than what you asked for may answer. You may go looking for the feeling of the money being handled and find grief instead. You may reach for the relationship and meet the fear underneath it. Do not treat that as the practice failing. That is the practice working exactly as its author intended, and arriving at the thing that has been in the way. Stay with it if you can. And if it is bigger than 4 minutes, if what comes up is old and heavy and has been waiting a long time, that is not a job for a video. That is a job for a person in a room with you who is trained for it. Both things are true. This is genuinely useful, and it is not therapy, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling. Now the third element, and this is where the practice becomes Jung's and nobody else's. There is a difference between watching a scene and being inside one, and that difference is not a matter of degree. It is a change of kind. It is the whole thing. Do not watch yourself. Do not see yourself across the room, or above it, or standing in the doorway, the way you appear to yourself in a memory or in a film. That is the default. It is comfortable, and it produces precisely nothing, because a person observed at a distance is a person you are still separate from. You have built a small cinema and cast yourself in it, and you are still in the seat. The seat is where you have been sitting your entire life. Get out of the seat. Be inside it. Look out through your own eyes. Have hands in the scene, at the ends of your own arms, doing something ordinary. Then go to the senses, one at a time, from the least dramatic upward. Feel the temperature of the air on the backs of your hands. Feel the weight of your body pressing down into whatever is holding you, and the way it presses back. Take a breath in that place, and let it be the air of that room, and not this one. Let a sound arrive from somewhere off to the side that you did not construct. A door somewhere in the building, traffic 2 streets away, someone in another room who is not talking to you. That last one is the marker. When something enters the scene that you did not deliberately place there, you are no longer building. You are inside. Notice. None of that is impressive. There is no yacht in it, no stage, no applause, no keys to anything. The single most common error in visualization is going straight for the trophy, and the trophy is the one thing your nervous system has the least ability to believe. So don't reach for the summit of it. Reach for the Tuesday afterward, not the moment the money lands, the ordinary morning 6 weeks later when you check the balance for a boring administrative reason and feel nothing at all. Not the wedding, the 2 of you in a kitchen, not talking, and the silence being comfortable. Not the diagnosis reversed in a consulting room, the afternoon a month later when you realize you have gone 4 hours without thinking about your body once. The aftermath is always more believable than the event, and believability is the entire currency here. Now, I want to tell you about a beetle. Twice in the early 1950s, once in a lecture, once in the essay that followed it, Jung wrote up a case he said had never repeated itself. Nothing like it ever happened to me before or since, is how he put it. He had been treating a young woman he described as psychologically inaccessible, in spite of efforts made on both sides. A highly polished Cartesian rationalism, he called it, with an impeccably geometrical idea of reality. Her intellect was formidable, and it was also the fortification. Everything he offered got processed, categorized, and neutralized before it could reach her. He wrote that he had been reduced to hoping something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something her reason could not domesticate. One session she was describing a dream from the night before, in which she had been given a piece of jewelry, a golden scarab. While she was in the middle of telling it, Jung heard a soft, insistent tapping at the window behind him. He turned around. There was an insect knocking against the glass from the outside, trying to get into the darkened room, which he noted was contrary to that species' habits entirely. He opened the window and caught it in his hand as it flew in. It was a rose chafer, Cetonia aurata, the common scarabaeid beetle of that latitude, gold-green, and the closest thing to a golden scarab that exists in Switzerland. Holding it out to her, he said, "Here is your scarab." That, he wrote, punctured the desired hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. From that point, the treatment could proceed. I am not going to tell you what that story means, and I want you to notice that Jung didn't either. He built an entire concept around it, synchronicity, and he was careful his whole life never to claim it as a cause. He called it an acausal connecting principle, which is a very deliberate piece of phrasing, a relationship that is meaningful without one thing making the other happen. My reason for including it is much narrower, because when this practice starts to work for you, the first evidence will not be the thing you asked for. It will be something small, sideways, and oddly timed. A name that surfaces twice in 2 days. A conversation that turns without being steered. A door that was closed being open when you happened to pass it. Your rational mind will file it as coincidence, and it may well be right. But notice how you respond to it, because the person who is still in lack explains it away immediately, and the person who has entered the state says, yes, and goes through. Now we come to the element nobody teaches, and it is the one I would keep if I had to throw away the other 4. Say nothing. Tell no one, not your partner, not the friend who would be genuinely happy for you, not the group chat, not the internet, not the person who introduced you to this kind of material in the first place and would most want to hear about it. Nothing, until it is real in the world. I know exactly how that sounds. It sounds superstitious. The evil eye, don't jinx it, touch wood. Set that aside, because there is a much less mystical explanation available, and it happens to be extremely well documented. There is research on what happens when people announce their goals, and the best-known study on it is quietly devastating. 4 experiments, published in 2009, led by a psychologist at New York University named Peter Gollwitzer. The finding: when a goal is tied to your sense of who you are, and you tell someone about it, and they take notice, you become measurably less likely to follow through on it. Not more, less. The interpretation the researchers landed on is the part that should stop you. Recognition is the reward. Their words were that being noticed gives a person a premature sense of possessing the aspired-to identity. You are seen as the one who is going to do it, and some part of you accepts that as delivery. The payoff arrives on announcement, and once the payoff has been collected, the pressure that was going to drive the work quietly drains out of the system, and you are left with something that feels wonderful and is completely inert, a beautifully articulated intention that will never happen. Here is the detail that makes it worse. The effect was strongest in the people who cared the most. You have felt this. Everyone has. That plan you described brilliantly at dinner and never started. The business you explained so well that people were impressed, and that does not exist. The version of yourself you have now described so many times that describing it has become the hobby. There is the leak. Now put that next to what this practice is doing. You are working with something faint, a shift at the back of the neck, a warmth in the chest that lasts 9 seconds. That is not a robust signal. It is a small, new, easily flooded thing, and you are proposing to take it out into a room and hold it up for evaluation. It will not survive that, not because people are cruel, because it is small, and because the moment it is spoken, it stops being a state and becomes a claim, and a claim invites assessment, and you will find yourself defending it, and the moment you are defending it, you are back in the posture of a person who does not have it. Speaking it converts a state into an argument. Jung would have recognized this immediately, and not from psychology. He spent the last 30 years of his working life on alchemy, and it was not a hobby. He produced 3 enormous volumes on it, thousands of pages, and he considered the alchemists his true predecessors. He wrote that their experiences were, in a sense, his experiences, and their world was his world. His argument was that when those men wrote about transmuting base metal into gold, the chemistry was largely a screen. What they were describing, without knowing they were describing it, was the transformation of the human interior. They were projecting the process of the psyche onto matter and then dutifully writing down what they saw. One requirement dominates the whole alchemical literature, obsessively: the vessel, the vas hermeticum, the hermetic vessel, and the reason we still use that word. It has to be sealed, not covered, not mostly closed, hermetically sealed, because the transformation is driven by heat and pressure held over time, and the instant the seal breaks, the pressure equalizes with the room, the heat dissipates, the process stops, and nothing further happens. Not damaged, just stopped. You cannot open the vessel to check whether it's working. The checking is the opening. There is a much older version of the same instruction, from a tradition Jung read carefully. He wrote a commentary on a Chinese alchemical text in 1929 and a foreword to the I Ching 20 years later, and he was clear that the East had mapped some of this long before European psychology arrived at it, while also warning Westerners, repeatedly, not to simply help themselves to Eastern methods. Those words are not Jung's. They belong to Lao Tzu, chapter 56 of the Tao Te Ching. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. More than 2,000 years before a laboratory in Germany measured it. So, know it on the inside. Stay quiet on the outside. This is not deception, and it is not you hiding. You are not lying to anyone. You are simply not filing a progress report on a process that has not finished. You owe no one an update on what you are becoming. Let it grow in the dark, the way every living thing that has ever grown has grown. A seed in soil, a child in a womb, a photographic plate in a lightless room. None of them announce themselves, and none of them survive being pulled up to see how they're doing. One day you will simply arrive somewhere different, and people will say you got lucky. Let them. You will know what it cost, and you will know it was silent. Now the fifth element, and this is where almost everyone's practice dies. Not during, after. Picture the shape of a normal morning. You do the 4 minutes, and it works. You get the shift, the shoulders drop, something in you briefly agrees. 4 minutes of a state you have not been in for years. And then you open your eyes and pick up your phone. Within 90 seconds you have read something designed by extremely competent people to produce alarm in you. Within 4 minutes you have checked an account balance, or a message that hasn't been answered, or a number that is meant to be higher than it is. Within 10, you are in the shower, running the same argument you have run every morning for 11 months. You have spent 4 minutes carefully planting something, and then you went out and dug it up with your own hands to see whether it had taken. Every single morning. And then you wonder why nothing grows. I need you to hear this without softening it, because it is the most important practical thing in this video. The 4 minutes are not the practice. The 4 minutes are the deposit. The 18 hours are the practice. So, the return. 3 things, and they are all small. First, do not open your eyes fast. When the 4 minutes are done, stay where you are for another 30 seconds with your eyes still closed. Don't do anything. Don't review it or grade it or wonder whether it worked. Let the state sit in the body unexamined, the way you let a room stay warm without measuring it. Then open your eyes without hurrying and look at one ordinary object properly, a door frame, a mug, your own hand, before you look at anything with words on it. Second, the first 15 minutes belong to you, not to the phone, not to the news, not to the inbox, not to anything with a notification attached. 15 minutes. This is the single highest leverage instruction in this entire video, and it is also the one you are most likely to skip, because it costs something real, and it costs it every day. The state you built is at its most fragile in those 15 minutes. It has not consolidated. It is a new signal in a nervous system with decades of practice at a different one, and if the first input of your day is engineered alarm, the old signal wins in under a minute, and you will spend the rest of the day operating from precisely the state you sat down to leave. Third, catch yourself in the act. Sometime in the afternoon you will feel the grip come back. You will notice yourself calculating, or refreshing, or rehearsing a conversation that hasn't happened. You do not need to meditate. You do not need to sit down or close your eyes or find a quiet room. Just ask the question again. Silently, mid-stride, in a corridor. If it were already done, what would I feel right now? 2 seconds. That's all it takes, because you've already built the road. And the shoulders will drop, slightly, in a corridor, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. That is the entire fifth element. 30 seconds of stillness. 15 minutes that belong to you. One question, whenever you notice the grip, do it for a week, and you will notice something strange happening at the edges. Not the thing you asked for, something else first. You will find you are sleeping differently, that a conversation you have been dreading is somehow not that bad. That you said no to something without the 20 minutes of dread you would normally pay for it. That you are less interested in the opinion of someone whose opinion has governed you for years. Those are not side effects. That is the change arriving in the only order it ever arrives in. Because the outer life does not turn all at once, and it never announces itself. It turns the way a season turns, not on a particular day, but in 100 small, unremarkable adjustments that you only recognize afterward, looking back, and realizing you cannot say precisely when things stopped being what they were. Now I want to say the hardest thing in this video, and it is hard, because it sounds like the opposite of everything you were promised at the beginning. You are going to have to stop wanting it. Not stop caring, not give up, not settle, not talk yourself into being content with less than you came here for. Something much more specific than that, and much stranger. Put it down instead, because wanting is not a neutral force, and this is the part almost nobody is told. Wanting has a posture, and the posture is leaning forward, permanently, toward a place you are not, and you cannot lean toward something and stand in it at the same time. The body will not do both. It has never been able to. Watch what changes in a person the moment they genuinely stop needing something. They stop performing. They stop checking. They stop rehearsing the conversation and refreshing the page and running the arithmetic at 2 in the morning. They become, almost immediately, the most attractive version of themselves that has existed in years, not because anything about them improved, but because the grip came off, and everyone in a 50-foot radius could feel it come off. You have met this person. You may have been this person once, by accident, about something you had stopped caring about, and you will remember that it went unreasonably well, and that you found this slightly insulting. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a cruel joke about the universe. It is the mechanism, showing you its hand. Jung had a word for the destination of all this, and it was not manifestation. He would have had very little patience for the word. He called it individuation, the long process of becoming the particular person you are, instead of the assembled person you were told to be. And he was blunt that it is not a process you can drive, you can consent to it, you can stop obstructing it, you can create the conditions and then get out of the way, which is precisely what these 5 elements are, conditions, and then getting out of the way. One sentence of his, the real one, from Ion, not the softened version that circulates on posters, that is a warning far more than it is a comfort. When an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. Sit with the word appears. He is not saying your circumstances are imaginary. He is saying that a state you have never looked at directly will arrange itself in front of you, out in the world, wearing the costume of things that are simply happening to you. Everything you have been calling bad luck, the pattern in the relationships, the ceiling you keep meeting at the same height, decade after decade, the particular kind of opportunity that always seems to go to someone else. None of that was fate. A state was running underneath everything, for years, unexamined, and running your life with total competence and zero supervision. 4 minutes a day is you finally supervising it. That is all this is. Not magic, not a shortcut, and not a substitute for a life. 4 minutes of deliberately occupying a state that has already been available to you since childhood, and then 18 hours of not tearing it down. You are not acquiring anything here. You are stopping something you have already been doing to yourself for years without ever being told you were doing it. This feels too simple, because you have been taught, thoroughly and by people who meant well, that the price of real change must be suffering. It isn't. The price is consistency, in private, with nobody watching, on the days you can't be bothered. That's a harder price than suffering. It's just a quieter one. So let me put it all in one place. Everything in this video, in the order you will do it, tonight. Find a door you can close. Any door. Put the phone in another room. Sit down. Let your hands fall where they fall. Close your eyes and breathe out longer than you breathe in. And keep doing that until something in your chest lets go on its own. Bring the one thing to mind. The one, not the list. and don't picture it. Ask instead, if this were already done and I already knew, what would I feel right now? Then stop and wait and let your body answer, because it is the only part of you that has never learned how to lie about this. Whatever comes will be small. Take it anyway. Now go inside it. Not watching from the doorway, inside, looking out through your own eyes, with your own hands in front of you. Feel the air on the backs of them. Take one breath of that room instead of this one. Let a sound arrive from off to the side that you did not put there. Stay 4 minutes, or 3, or as long as it holds. Don't move. Stay another 30 seconds with your eyes closed, and don't examine it. Don't grade it. Don't ask whether it worked. Open your eyes slowly. Look at something ordinary before you look at anything with words on it. Then say nothing about it. To anyone. Tonight, or tomorrow, or next week, not until it is standing in the world where it doesn't need your defense. Give yourself the first 15 minutes of tomorrow. When the grip comes back in the afternoon, and it will, ask the question again, mid-stride, in a corridor, and let your shoulders drop 2 seconds later. That's it. That is the whole thing. You are not hoping. Hope is a posture of distance, and there is no distance in this. You are not visualizing a future. You are occupying a present that has already happened and has not finished becoming visible. You are not becoming the person who will have it. You are being the person who already does. And that distinction between a life spent leaning toward something and a life spent standing in it is the closest thing to a secret that Carl Jung ever left behind. He spent 6 years in the dark finding it. He filled a red book nobody was allowed to open for 96 years, and then he spent 45 more turning it into something a person could use on an ordinary evening in an ordinary room, which is where you are. One quiet 4 minutes at a time, one honest answer from the body at a time, one morning that belongs to you and to nobody else at a time. Before you go, one question, and I'd like you to sit with it instead of scrolling past it. Not what you want. Everybody knows what they want. What would be different in your body tomorrow morning if it were already handled? That's the one. Put it below, in whatever words come out first, because writing it down is the second time your body has to answer it, and the second time is always more honest than the first. I read them, and if this reached something in you, if one idea in the last 80 minutes opened a door that has been shut for a long time, subscribe to Carl Jung Philosophy, where we go into the parts of this man's work that the quote graphics never touch, the parts he actually meant. Share this with someone who has been trying to change their life from the outside and has been trying for a long time and is tired. Because the door was never locked at all. It never has been. Tonight, you simply stopped knocking on it.